right. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Warren Cole Smith. So it's three names, Warren Cole Smith. Make sure you type that in when you look for this book that he just published, the title of which is Faith-Based Fraud, Learning from the Great Religious Scandals of Our Time, just published May 2021. And Warren Cole Smith is president of Ministry.com, which is dedicated to bringing transparency, accountability, and restored credibility to the Christian ministry world. Before joining Ministry Watch, he held leadership positions at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview and World Magazine. Warren also hosts the weekly podcast Listening In, a long-form interview program heard by tens of thousands of subscribers each week. Before transitioning to a career in ministry 20 years ago, Warren, for 15 years, was in the corporate world, including 7 years as the marketing director for a major division of PricewaterhouseCoopers, the global accounting and consulting firm. So we're going to talk about this book. It's an excellent book. It gave me a lot of insight. It was a kind of wide-angle view of a lot of the problems in modern evangelical ministries. And some of the names people may know or not know, but he's going to talk more about that. So Warren Cole Smith, are you there?
I am. Well, thank you. It's good to be on with you, William.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, thanks for agreeing to the interview. For people who may not have heard your background, can you talk about how you got involved in Ministry Watch and what led you to write this book, Faith-Based Fraud?
Yeah, well, I'll kind of go back to the very beginning, I guess you could say, and you can fast forward me through some of this if you want. But, I became interested in writing and journalism when I was in high school, and wrote I went to the University of Georgia, and they have a pretty good journalism program, usually rated a top 25 journalism program in the country, and I wrote for the school newspaper. So I've had a long time fascination with journalism, and I've also been, I hesitate to use the word committed Christian because I've been more or less committed at different times over the years. But, I've taken my faith seriously since I was a teenager. And so for me, writing in journalism and my Christian faith were two parts of my life that I just, didn't really want to separate, didn't see a need to separate. So I've kind of been involved in writing about religion and the intersection between religion, politics, and culture for a lot of years. And, that led me eventually into working for World Magazine. World Magazine is arguably the largest Christian news magazine in the country. World and Christianity Today are probably the two that argue about which one's the biggest, the most. But I spent a lot of time, 8 years full-time on staff there, did a lot of freelancing both before and after as well. And, over the years, I just would gravitate toward these big stories. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. Jim and Tammy Baker's PTL, empire was based here in Charlotte. And even though I didn't move to Charlotte until after that scandal had already broken, it's kind of in the water here. So you end up, knowing about it. Mark Etheridge is a friend of mine. He was the editor of the Charlotte Observer whenever the Charlotte Observer broke all of those news stories about PTL, and they ultimately won a Pulitzer Prize for that story. So I, in some ways, kind of feel like I had a front row seat, or at least a second or a third row seat to that PTL scandal. And then over the years, just got interested in other stories. Some of them I covered myself. Some of the stories in the book include the sort of the scandal at Mars Hill Church in Seattle, Washington. I broke a lot of the important stories related to that. Bill Gothard is a pretty well-known leader in the homeschool community in particular. Back in the 70s and 80s, he used to do stadium events that would attract 15 or 20,000 people to these big stadium events. And so, like I say, just over the years, I've covered these events. But as a Christian, my goal was never to, kind of tear down these organizations or institutions. Always my goal personally was to say, what can we do to reform Christianity? What can we do to learn from these scams and scandals so that they don't recur, so that they don't repeat, so that we can guard against them, we can prevent them in the future? So that, William, that has kind of always been my motivation and what has driven me, and that's ultimately what led to this book.
Right, and I think you state over and over in your book that investigative journalism is a crucial element in kind of looking into these problems that have happened in many of these different evangelical churches or mega churches. And you actually start your book off with a very interesting character that I think really does typify some of these events in these churches, and his name was Charles Ponzi. Can you talk a little bit about him and why he's relevant to the modern problems in the modern evangelical church?
Yeah, well, I will. Let me just say, though, you mentioned something that I can't let pass, and that is just the role of investigative journalism. That's work that you do, for example. And I think that, and I think journalism is vital. Investigative journalism is vital. So, yeah, I think it is an indispensable. Not only is it in the First Amendment, freedom of the press, but it's just government regulation doesn't seem to work. Watchdog organizations, like in my world, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, don't really seem to do the job. I think they're important. I think government regulations to a certain extent are important, and organizations like the ECFA are important. But I think it takes investigative journalism to really operate in an uninhibited and independent way to bring down a lot of these worst kinds of frauds. So I think that, that's in some ways a subtext of this book is just the importance of investigative journalism. But back to your question about Ponzi. Yeah, I started with Charles Ponzi, even though a lot of people don't think of him as a quote unquote faith-based fraud. And it also happened, 100 years ago now. It happened in the 1920s. But I wanted to start with that story because everybody's heard of a Ponzi scheme. And it also allowed me to sort of define terms going forward that would be used over and over again in the book. Words like Ponzi scheme, words like affinity fraud, and why is it that people will trust other people to give them money? What are kind of the skills that the fraudster has to get people to give them money? And I thought that Charles Ponzi's life and story really brought a lot of those ideas vividly to life. For those who don't know who Charles Ponzi was, he lived in the Boston. He became most famous. He lived all over the place, but he became most famous for a time that he spent in Boston. And he was from Italy, and he was sort of actively involved in the sort of the Italian Catholic community in Boston. So there was a faith-based element to what he was doing. He sort of community and affinity fraud was at work here. People trusted him because he was, paisano. He's one of us, and so they would. That was one of the reasons that they gave him money, and we see that characteristic over and over again. People, they're what I say in the book, William, is there are two ways to earn trust. One is you can earn it. You can actually work with somebody and make agreements with them and keep your agreements and do that over and over again, and people learn to trust you because you're as good as your word. The other way is not called earned trust, but imputed trust. And that's because I get that trust, not because of anything I've done, but because of people I know. People might say, well, yeah, I know William. He's a good guy. You can trust William. Well, they're taking my word for it in that case. They've really not, actually seen you behave and earn the trust. They're just taking my word for it and they trust me, or vice versa. That's what happened with Ponzi. That's what happens with a lot of affinity frauds, and especially faith-based frauds, that they will trust people in that community without really doing the kind of due diligence that they would normally do when they give people money. So anyway, Ponzi came up with this scheme that involved postal codes. I describe it pretty in depth in the book, and I can do that, William, here if you want me to. But for now, I'll just say that you could buy these postal codes for these postal stamps, if you will. They were international reply coupons, is what they were technically called. And you could buy them for one price, but you could sell them for another price. And so that's what Ponzi told people he was doing. He was going to make money on the difference between the price of the buying and the price of the selling of those things. In the financial terms, that's called arbitrage. And there's nothing illegal about it. And if Ponzi had actually gone through with his scheme, it might have worked. He might have been able to buy these coupons for 6 cents a piece and sell them for 8, or buy them for 4 cents and sell them for 6. And if you bought enough of them, he could make some money on it. The problem is he never intended to do what he said he was going to do. He just took people's money. He never bought any of these international reply coupons, never invested in them. Instead, he lived a lavish lifestyle. He made people believe that he was wildly successful. And that is another characteristic of frauds is they make people believe they're successful so that other people will give them money. We saw that with Bernie Madoff. We saw that even with Jim and Tammy Baker. They lived a lavish lifestyle. A lot of the prosperity gospel preachers will do that. They made people believe that their ideas must be true because look what it's done for me. Well, the bottom line was that Ponzi was simply paying his early investors off with later investors, and eventually, like all Ponzi schemes, you run out of later investors. The scheme falls apart, and that's what happened with Charles Ponzi. But again, it's 100 years old, and you might think, well, why are you using that as the opening story in your book? But it's because it allows me to really get at these issues of affinity fraud and earned trust versus imputed trust, and the characteristics that these fraudulent people often have. The point being that we should be wary of them. We should now look for them. We can learn from those experiences and hopefully not duplicate them.
And I think you do a great job in that book defining all those terms so people can understand them clearly, defining arbitrage, defining the Ponzi scheme, because you see those, I mean, as you know, you see those phenomenons in these later churches and how they become irresponsible. Some, like you say, aren't starting to be involved in a Ponzi scheme, but some things just get out of hand without oversight or things like that. That's a common theme in your book. But can you talk about, and you also, one of the interesting things you note in your book is that Charlotte is kind of an epicenter for a certain type of Christianity. There's so much of a centrality of all these other groups are around Charlotte. So PTL was part of some of this other stuff that's happening. But can you talk about Jim and Tammy Baker and how they got in trouble?
Yeah, Jim and Tammy Baker is an interesting story because, as you said, not everybody, starts off as frauds. So I think a lot of people start off with good intentions. And another theme of the book is this notion of transparency and accountability. I sometimes call transparency and accountability the two guardrails that should be in place on the sides of the road. Otherwise, you're going to run off the road. And I think that is really more what happened with Jim and Tammy Faye. They started off, a young couple, kind of a sweet young couple. Everybody wanted to kind of pat them on the head whenever they would come perform in local churches. And they, developed kind of a shtick, I guess you could say, as almost like George Burns and Gracie Allen. They were actually compared by the older people in their churches when they were getting their start in the 60s and 70s to George Burns and Gracie Allen. So it was an act that they did live in churches to kind of minister to the local congregations, but it was also an act that translated really well to television whenever the burgeoning Christian television scene was kind of coming along in the 70s. And so they ended up, helping. They were instrumental. Jim and Tammy Faye were instrumental in the founding of several of the largest Christian television networks in the country. The Christian Broadcasting Network, Pat Robertson's network that was founded in Virginia Beach, Virginia, the Trinity Broadcasting Network, which is the big, mega ministry, mega network that's out in California, and what ultimately became the Inspiration Network, PTL and the Inspiration Networks here in the Charlotte area as well. So, they were kind of at the right place at the right time with the right skill set, and so things got really, really successful for them quickly. They were at a fairly young age. But again, because they didn't have those guardrails around them, they didn't have, people that were telling them, hey, you can't do this, or you shouldn't do things in this particular way. They were so young and inexperienced, and the money just started pouring in once they got on television, that it became a real problem for them to handle. And, the scandal itself was pretty kind of vanilla. They built this big hotel, this resort here in the Charlotte area called Heritage USA, and they sold basically memberships to the hotel. You might all call it a timeshare, where you could, for a certain amount of money, you could spend a week, a year at the hotel. But the problem, William, is that they way oversold it. In other words, you got so many rooms in the hotel, so many weeks during the year. That should, that's just a simple math problem. It'll tell you how many you can sell. And they ended up selling far, far more of those memberships than they had any possible way of a meeting. And so that is sort of the specific nature of their fraud, was wire fraud and mail fraud and overpromising and not being able to deliver. But, in the midst of it all, there were just all kinds of things came out. They were buying Rolls Royces. They were flying in private jets. They were living in mansions. They were buying, $10,000 dog houses for their poodle. I mean, it just got completely out of hand.
I think you said they took a plane to Palm Springs, but paid for the plane to wait for them in Palm Springs. So they paid some exorbitant amount of money. So yeah, a lot of kind of real problems, but it unwound into a huge loss for a lot of people. And I think that's a tragic theme in the book, is that a lot of people lose livelihoods. They lose their well-being and their security by these people who let these churches get out of hand. Can you talk about how much money was lost at PTL?
Yeah, it's funny, William, I wrote the book, so I should know the answer to that question.
It's 150 million. I think it was.
Yeah, I was going to say 150 million. I'm glad that's actually the right answer. But yeah, and you're right. You really raise an important point here, and that is that, these stories are fascinating. We can look at Charles Ponzi, or we can look at, Jim and Tammy Baker and the PTL, and we think, they're flamboyant people. They're, larger than life. They make great stories. They're kind of fun to listen to their stories or hear their stories, and maybe we can learn a few lessons. But you raised a point that I hope that that our listeners don't gloss over, and that is that there are real victims here. That there are people that invested thousands of dollars with Jim and Tammy Baker, and they couldn't afford that $1,000. Those thousands, they were making real sacrifices in order to invest that, what might seem in the grand scheme of things a relatively small amount of money, and a relatively small amount of money in the context of the $150 million that was ultimately involved here. But, for a couple that's, maybe an elderly couple that's living on a fixed income, or a young couple with a family that's, kind of living paycheck to paycheck and hoping that they've got enough money at the end of the month to buy their kids a new pair of shoes. This is real money to them, and they were victimized. That I often say that ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims, and there are real victims here, and we're talking about a lot of money. And of course, the other aspect of this, which you were, I think, also alluding to, is at its peak, as near as I can tell, there were about 3,000 people that were working for the PTL network and all of its various ministries that basically just lost their jobs virtually overnight. And so there are real people whose lives were affected. Kids that didn't get to go to college because of the money lost, homes that, were lost, or opportunities that were not able to be seized by these families that, could have multi-generational consequences given the way, wealth is accumulated in this country. So, these aren't just funny stories or even interesting stories. These are in some ways really tragic stories that we need that recur over and over again. That's why we need to really take a deep look into them and learn the lessons that are there.
Yeah, and there's a lot of lessons there with Jim and Tammy Baker. They were really kind of one of the first at the peak, like I think you noted in your book, of television, but they were not the last. Can you talk about Todd Bentley and your experiences? Like, you're doing some of the research and looking into these televangelists individually, and Todd Bentley is an interesting character. Can you talk about him?
Yeah, Todd Bentley is a bizarre character. Once again, a Charlotte guy. I mean, it was in fact on the old kind of the ruins of the old PTL network. There's a guy named Rick Joyner who has created Morning Star Ministries, and he's down there. And Todd Bentley was kind of in Rick Joyner's universe or constellation of stars or whatever it might be. But Todd Bentley is again one of these kind of larger than life flamboyant characters. He had a lot of tattoos, and he just kind of looked like a biker dude in some ways, but he was a great communicator. And that's one of the things that you often find, William, is that these guys rise because of competence and fall because of character. And that it's not that they don't have gifts. It's not that they don't have skills and qualities that are worth admiring. Often they really do. And Todd Bentley was one of those guys who was a gifted communicator. He could preach, and he could get people, could attract people to him. And there was a season, back, I don't know, it's probably 10 or 12 years ago now, where he was down in Lakeland, Florida, which is in the Orlando area. And by the way, I should say that Charlotte, Colorado Springs, and Orlando are kind of the three big evangelical meccas in this country. There are a lot of Christian ministries concentrated in those three cities. So anyway, he was, in Central Florida, and he started preaching kind of a tent revival thing. Well, one thing led to another, and he started making these outrageous claims, and his staff started doing things that were, not strictly true, like, saying that people had been healed at his services, and folks just started coming. They just started coming. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of people. They erected these huge circus, style tents there. They were on an old airport. They actually erected it on an airport and on the runway. And so because they were kind of far out, they actually set up ATM machines in the tent. Wow. So that when they passed the bucket around, people would have cash to be able to put in the bucket. He said, well, if you don't have any cash, that's fine. Just, we've got an ATM machine in the lobby. And so it just, gives you an idea of the brazenness of this thing. But so I'm following this thing, William, and they hire a publicist, and she's reaching out to the media, and I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm going to take them seriously. They're claiming to heal people. I want a list of the people that have been healed, and I want to interview them. I want to talk to them. And that went on for months and months and months, where they wouldn't give me a list. But finally, I was amazed. I remember one day sitting in my office whenever I got to get this email. I'd actually forgotten that I'd made the request. It had been so many months earlier. And I get this list. And it's got like 13 names on it. And I just start, using Google and a background check program that that I subscribe to. I start calling these folks, and was able to get in touch with most of them. And, just to kind of fact check these stories. And as it turns out, I mean, I'll spare you a lot of details here unless you want to ask about them, William, but it was completely fraudulent. I mean, there was not one person on that list that had really been healed of what it was that they had said that they'd been healed of. And in fact, by the time I got to a couple of them, they were already dead. Two of them were dead. And this was, probably 10 years ago now, whenever this thing was going on and I did the original research. That article was originally published in World Magazine. I did a little fact checking whenever I published the book. I went back and sort of updated them. A couple more had died since, then. So again, these are real victims, real people, real families that are being taken advantage of here. In some ways you can think, well, this is just kind of a crazy story and isn't it interesting and funny? But it's not. It's tragic. These are people's lives that have been changed forever because of the frauds of these people, of these events.
And they're super vulnerable too. So that's what's even worse. Is that they want healing. He claims to be a faith healer. Then it doesn't happen, or it's manipulative, and maybe they lost money. You don't know whether those guys, Christopher Fogel, how much money they gave Bentley or what it was, right? Because there's kind of like this prosperity theme within a lot of these guys is you pay for blessings. It's almost like you compare it to the indulgences of the Catholic Church.
That's exactly right. And you're raising a good point, because even if, you mentioned Chris Fogel, he was one of the guy, he was the guy that I started that chapter with, where, he loved to go fishing with his family, and a young father, and, they claimed he was completely healed. By the time I got to the story and started doing the fact checking, he had already died of the cancer that he had supposedly been healed of. So even if Chris Fogel, maybe didn't lose a bunch of money, that story was used over and over and over again by Todd Bentley to raise money from others. So he was raising money using completely fraudulent means in order to do that. So, and you also raised another point where they're vulnerable. I mean, these, by their very nature, a lot of times, people don't show up with, stage 4 cancer at events like this unless they've tried everything else. I mean, they've tried everything and it's not working. So yes, they're vulnerable. They're desperate for a solution, and they got a guy, there's a guy that tells them that they've got a solution. So yeah, it's just reprehensible, the behavior. And by the way, I say this as a Christian. I believe in God. I believe in miracles. I believe in healing, but not this way. This is not the way it's supposed to happen.
Yeah, and what's really also another theme is some of these the numbers you're talking about and some of these preachers are enormous, or some of these Christian groups. I was shocked, like tens of hundreds of billions of dollars are being spent on these non-taxable institutions. It's incredible how much money is really around. And these are just two examples of some of the abuse of that money, but there's a lot of donations and a lot of really well-meaning people who want to give their money to good causes. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, that's right. In fact, I want to. You're reminding me of another point that I want to make, and that is that Christian ministries do great work in this country. I've got some statistics in the book that say that something along the lines of 7% of our GDP is from nonprofit organizations, and there are lots of different kinds of nonprofit organizations, but the reality is the vast majority of them are religious nonprofit organizations. Churches and the big nonprofit organizations like World Vision, for example, a $2 billion organization, Compassion International, a $1 billion organization. We at Ministry Watch, I'm the president of Ministry Watch where I am now, we have a database of about 950 of the largest Christian ministries in the country with their financial statements there. And William, those organizations represent $34 billion a year in annual giving. So this is real money. This is a real industry. It needs to behave with integrity and transparency. And so that's, kind of what our mission at Ministry Watch is about, and what my mission here at the book is as well.
Right. And I mean, that's an incredible, there's a real incentive to be in this line of work if that much money is floating around with all those benefits of these churches, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's another great point. What was that guy that they asked him why he robbed banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. And in some ways, that's why, I think some people, either get into Christian ministry or fall into fraud after they've been in Christian ministry, because they just realize how much money is involved here, and it's possible to get wealthy, and many people have. In fact, we've got a story coming up soon about the Inspiration Networks. The president of the Inspiration Networks, David Cirillo, made $7 million last year. That was his personal compensation. And so there's the Trinity Broadcasting Network, which I've already mentioned once in our conversation, William. One of those organizations that Jim and Tammy Baker helped found back in the 70s. They're going through a very complicated reorganization now, and so we're able to get kind of a peek at what their financial assets are in a way that we haven't been able to do that in the past, because they're moving from California to Texas, and the regulations are requiring some of their documents to be disclosed. But they have about $1 billion in assets, not to mention the fact that they have between $50 and $100 million a year coming in donation income. So there's a lot of money.
It's incredible. And they don't have the same reporting requirements as your standard corporation or anything like that.
That's exactly right. Yep.
That's even more curious, is that the government allows these nonprofits to flying blind. And I mean, you have secrets in there that I didn't know about, the Grassley 6, who were less than willing to be transparent about where their money's going. And those are huge numbers. And one of your chapters is about what plane would Jesus fly. Like, these guys are living larger than the heads of some corporations in this country.
Well, that's right. And it's funny you mentioned that, because Charles Grassley's back in the news, and we can talk about that in a minute if you want, because he's trying to regulate Christian, one small aspect of Christian ministries again now. But yeah, the Grassley 6 was an investigation by Senator Charles Grassley into 6 televangelists. It resulted in nothing good came out of it. I mean, there was one ministry, Joyce Meyer Ministries, made some reforms, but for the most part, no reforms whatsoever. But the key learning, I think, that a lot of the public got out of that was exactly what you just said, William, and that is that if I'm the CEO of a publicly traded company, I have to do far more disclosure, than a Christian ministry does these days. I mean, I understand religious liberty issues. I understand that it is dangerous whenever the government starts poking its nose into churches and nonprofit organizations and so on. And I am not in favor of, a high level of government regulation. I've got a wide libertarian streak running down my back. But we've got regulations in the nonprofit world that haven't been amended since the 1960s. And think about what's happened since the 1960s. Cable television, satellite radio, the internet. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on of the changes that we have had in the media landscape and just in the economic and business landscape since the mid-60s, which was the last time that there was any comprehensive reform of nonprofit laws. in my view, even though I'm not a big government oversight kind of a guy, we need not more regulation, but a re-regulation of the Christian nonprofit sector so that we can get more transparency and accountability out of that world.
And you kind of make this point in the book too, is that even if the regulations are there, they'll just ignore them anyway. So it's like, what's the point of the regulation if
that's right?
If there's no penalty or there's no consequences of that? And I mean, some of the names of the people who didn't report to the Grassley Six were people that people know: Kenneth Copeland, Benny Hinn, Creflo Dollar, people you see on TV all the time. And yeah, it was just really fascinating to see that they were willing to really comply with the senator's request.
Yeah, they just basically said, no, we're not going to do it. And these days too, there's another phenomenon going on. If you're if you and I, William and Warren formed the William and Warren nonprofit organization to feed the hungry in our town or whatever it is, we've got to file a Form 990 every year. It's like a tax return, and it'll say how much money we take in, how much money we spend, how much money we make, you and I individually make. That's on the Form 990. But if you're a church, you don't have to do that. And it's called the Church Exemption. Well, now lots of ministries that don't marry, don't bury, don't have Sunday morning services, they're not really churches in any meaningful sense of the word at all, are claiming this church exemption in order not to make their 990s available to the public. That's a phenomenon that we've seen really grow in the last few years. It's something that we're trying to speak out against here at Ministry Watch. We don't think that is a good idea at all. And but yeah, I mean, just one more way that ministries can hide behind the disclosure requirements and say, we're not going to let people know what we're up to.
Yeah, no, it's really incredible because, like, even the reporting requirements for corporates, it's quarterly. There's massive requirements for public companies that are smaller than some of these churches, I would assume. So, yeah, it's kind of it's curious deregulation. But I think that you make the point; these mega churches are kind of a new phenomenon too. So, I think that maybe that the legal community really hasn't caught, or the Congress hasn't caught up with these massive churches. You said one of these churches had 21,000 members. It's just imagine how much money those guys are granting or generating per month. I mean, this big numbers, and you had some tragic stories about some of these pastors who get caught up without any oversight, without any, maybe they're not used to these organizations and they get in deep trouble. And there's been some real tragedies in the Christian evangelical community.
Yeah, there have been. And you're right. That's something we didn't even talk about when I was talking earlier about the changes that have happened. But in 1970, there were probably only about 15 megachurches in this country, Protestant megachurches. That's a megachurch defined as having more than 2,000 people attending on a Sunday morning. But like you just said, there are a number of churches that have more than 20,000 people who show up. Joel Osteen's church, Lakewood Church down in Houston, Texas, Rick Warren's Saddleback Church out in California, and the one that we spend a chapter on in the book is Willow Creek Community Church in the Chicago area. They grew kind of from the 1970s, mid-70s. They were founded from startup, from zero to 20,000 in multi-sites, and their pastor, Bill Hybels, we come to find out, had basically a private life. He ended up being involved in sexual liaisons and sexual abuse situations with members of his staff and others. And that church has recently kind of blown up and imploded in size. Another church, Mars Hill Church, which is in Seattle, Washington, that went from startup, zero to 15,000 members just within a matter of very few years. I ended up, when I was at World Magazine, writing a series of articles about Mars Hill Church. My articles weren't the only reason that church imploded, but very soon after an article that I wrote that talked about how Mark Driscoll had bought his way onto the New York Times bestseller list by fraudulently doing book purchases in bookstores all around the country. That church imploded and no longer exists. I mean, literally a year and a half after I had written my article, that church went from 15,000 to completely out of existence, dissolved as an organization. And, that's not the kind of thing take pride in, that we wrote an article about it and it caused that kind of change. But on the other hand, I'm not ashamed of it either. And if some positive change needs to happen there, and I also want to be clear that it wasn't just my article that brought that church down.
But what's shocking is how much money he spent to promote his book. I think you said it was like $210,000 to promote her. I was like, wow. Yeah. That's a significant investment.
Well, it is. They had to they paid a company called Result Source to sort of coordinate it. But the nutshell is that they had thousands of individuals all around the country that were using gift cards, primarily like Visa debit cards and that kind of thing that they would be given to go walk into a bookstore that they thought would be a New York Times reporting bookstore and buy these books so that they could, they ended up having to buy pretty close to 20,000 books in a single week to make it appear that these books were, bestsellers, that they were catching fire. But in fact, it was completely artificial. The church itself had to pay that money to pay for all these debit cards that were being used by these folks all over the country. So yeah, it was just a big scandal. It turns out that that's happened quite a lot. I mean, my chapter is about in the book is mostly about Mark Driscoll, but I also identify probably a half a dozen other pastors that have done the same thing.
Right. I mean, it's really incredible. And I think you said the EFCA, which you reference often in your book, prohibits that. So
yeah,
that was something there. I mean, it seems like the EFCA should have a little bit more power and authority. It doesn't seem like these guys are really abiding by that. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I have a kind of a love-hate relationship with the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. On the one hand, they have published some great standards. There's 7 standards of financial integrity that they publish on their website, are really thoughtful, well-done standards. The problem is they don't have any mechanism for holding ministries to those standards. That if a ministry chooses to adhere to those standards, that's a good thing. They can at least look at those and say, okay, these are best practices. This is what we should be doing. And if you've got leaders with integrity, they would do that. They would look at those printed standards and try to make sure that they're living up to them. But if another leader chooses not to, the ECFA can't do anything about it. And the other thing about the ECFA is that if I'm a ministry leader and I want to join the ECFA, not only do I have to adhere to those standards, but I have to pay the ECFA to be a member. And the larger the ministry, the more money I pay them. So there's an inherent conflict of interest. The ECFA is going to be discouraged from really confronting a member organization around some lapse in integrity, because they could lose that organization as a member, and therefore it'd be like firing a customer. They would lose that organization as a customer. So I think the ECFA does some good work, and but they can't do what really needs to be done, which is to hold organizations accountable. Another limitation is that there are 1 million Christian nonprofits in this country, but only about 2,500 members of the ECFA. So there's not really a stigma for not being a member. In other words, if you're a member, great. But if you're not a member, nobody, cares really. And so there's some real limitation with the ECFA. I'm glad they exist. I think we need them, but we need them and a whole lot more to really solve these problems of lack of integrity and credibility within the Christian ministry marketplace.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of fraud. You mentioned a lot more in this book, but it's also just the ones that may have not been busted for fraud. How many people are giving? What's their percentage of paying? In certain investor groups, you can't give a certain amount of money. You have to be accredited. But how many of these people are giving $1,000 of their $2,000 Social Security check to these guys? I don't know. There's no reporting requirement for that. I think that's it's a serious issue, and I think that people need to kind of be concerned about some of that, because it's about who's giving their last penny to some of these groups.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And in fact, I get stories at Ministry Watch every day where, people will say, hey, I've been given to this ministry for 20 years, and I read the profile that you guys published on Ministry Watch, and I'm never really going to give them another dime. Why didn't I know this, until now? And that's so, yeah, that's a real issue.
I mean, that one sequence if people just read that one page in your book about how many of these guys have nice Gulfstream jets and all these private Falcon jets, you'd be wondering, what are you paying your money? Is your money being transformed through a Christian idea to do the Christian work, or are you paying for these guys' salaries? But it's a great book. Warren Cole Smith. Love this book. Highly recommended. People should come read. There's a lot more in this book, but we're kind of wrapping up. We're about 40 minutes. Is there anything I missed or anything you'd like to leave? Your social media, or where's the best place for people to get the book Faith-Based Fraud?
Yeah, we're in all the usual places. We're Amazon and so on and so forth. My social media, Warren Cole Smith on Twitter, Warren Smith on Facebook. I'd be delighted to have some of your listeners follow me there, and we post our stories every day. We probably post anywhere from 2 to 5 stories a day on the Ministry Watch website, and so go to ministrywatch.com. And you can sign up for our daily emails, or you can just check us out, at your convenience whenever you want to there. And we try to keep up with what's going on in the ministry world. We write on the bad guys, but we also a couple times a week tell positive stories as well of organizations that are doing really good work. Because like I said, William, we need nonprofit organizations. We need Christian ministries. Alexis de Tocqueville, as far back as, the 1830s and 40s, when he wrote Democracy in America, said that these associations, these institutions of civil society, they're the glue that hold the culture together. We need them, but we need them to operate with integrity. And that's what we're trying to do at Ministry Watch.
I agree. So people go check that out, ministrywatch.com. I'm going to sign up for the emails myself today. Again, the name of the book is Faith-Based Fraud, Learning from the Great Religious Scandals of Our Time, published May 2021. And the author, again, is Warren Cole Smith. So get the full name, Warren Cole Smith. Warren, thanks so much for your time.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right, take care.